as you settle into comfort and let your body relax, we will travel together through time to explore a world that existed long before the first kings sat on their thrones and long before the pharaohs built their towering pyramids. This is a story about how people organized themselves and chose their leaders in humanity's earliest days. A hidden history written not in grand monuments, but in fragments of ancient pottery, in the careful layouts of forgotten settlements, and in traditions passed down through countless generations. Close your eyes, breathe deeply and slowly, and let your mind drift back through the ages to a time when the world was young and people were just beginning to discover how to live together in communities. When we think about ancient times, our minds often fill with images of powerful rulers wearing golden crowns, of mighty pharaohs commanding armies, of massive stone pyramids rising from desert sands. We think of Hammurabi creating his famous code of laws, or the legendary Nama, who supposedly united all of Egypt under his rule. These are the stories we hear, the names carved into monuments that still stand today. But what came before these great rulers? What about the thousands and thousands of years when humans lived together, made important decisions together, and followed leaders who had no crowns, no palaces, no armies to command? This is the hidden story we will explore tonight as you drift peacefully towards sleep. Let us begin our gentle journey in a time so distant it is hard to imagine. Picture small groups of people moving slowly across landscapes, following herds of wild animals, gathering plants and fruits as the seasons changed. These were the hunter-gatherer societies, and this way of life continued for most of human existence on this earth. For tens of thousands of years, people lived this way, and during all that time, they needed leadership just as much as any kingdom would later need its king. But their leaders looked very different from the rulers who would come much later. In these ancient communities, the most respected and trusted voice often belonged to the elders. Imagine an older person, their hair turned silver with age, their face lined with the marks of a long life filled with experiences both joyful and difficult. This elder had seen things that younger people had not witnessed. They remembered the terrible drought from 30 years before and how the tribe managed to survive it. They knew where to find water when the streams ran dry, because they had learned these precious secrets from their own elders, who had learned from theirs before them. They could tell you which plants would heal a wound and which berries would make someone very sick. They carried in their minds the stories of ancestors stretching back through many generations, stories that were not just entertainment around the fire, but contained vital lessons about how to live, how to settle disagreements peacefully, how to maintain harmony within the group. The power of these elders was remarkable because it came not from physical strength or weapons or threats of punishment, but from something much deeper and more lasting. They were living books in a world where nothing was written down. Every piece of important knowledge existed only in human memory. When someone needed to know the proper way to do something important, they asked an elder. When two families had a serious dispute, they brought it to an elder to settle fairly. When the group needed to decide whether to move to new hunting grounds or stay where they were, the elders were consulted and their advice was carefully considered. Their words carried great weight because everyone recognized the vast store of wisdom they represented. Think about what it would mean to be the person who remembers every important event from the past 50 or 60 years, who can recite the family connections of everyone in the community, who knows all the old agreements and traditions that hold society together. The authority of an elder was earned slowly, built up over an entire lifetime of learning and experience. As a young person, they would have listened very carefully to the elders of their own youth, memorizing the important stories and lessons. As they grew older and became adults, they added their own experiences to this knowledge, learning from both successes and mistakes. By the time their hair turned grey and their children had children of their own, they possessed a wealth of understanding that nobody younger could possibly match. When an elder spoke in the council gathering, people listened, not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely wanted to hear that wisdom. The elder's judgment was trusted because it was built on decades of careful observation and the accumulated knowledge of many generations before them. But elders were not the only source of authority in these early communities. There were also the shamans, the medicine men and women who dealt with the world of spirits and mysterious unseen forces. In a time when people believed that spirits lived in every tree and rock and stream, when they thought that the souls of their ancestors watched over the living from the spirit world, when they saw the hand of invisible powers in every storm and every successful hunt, the shaman held a very special kind of power. These were people who claimed to walk between two worlds, to communicate with spirits, to see and understand things that ordinary people could not perceive. The shaman's role was quite different from the elder's. While the elder relied on memory and tradition passed down through the generations, the shaman claimed to have direct access to the supernatural realm. When someone fell mysteriously ill with no obvious cause, the shaman would perform special rituals to discover the spiritual reason for the illness and drive it away. When the hunting was poor and the tribe faced the threat of hunger, the shaman would enter a deep trance and seek guidance from the spirits of the animals they hunted. These practices were not simple tricks or meaningless superstition, though people today might think so. They were sophisticated ways of dealing with a world that often seemed frightening and completely unpredictable. When a shaman entered a trance state, it was often a dramatic event that the whole community would witness together. The rhythmic beating of drums continuing for hours, the dancing that seemed to go on without end, the smoke rising from sacred fires. All of this would build to a powerful moment when the shaman seemed to leave their ordinary self behind and connect with the spirit world. In this altered state of consciousness, they might receive visions or messages that would guide the community's important decisions. Should they move to new territory? When should they perform the special ceremony and to ensure good hunting in the coming season? How could they heal someone who was very sick? These questions were answered not by practical logic alone, but by spiritual insight that the shaman gained from their connection to forces greater than any human. The healing work of shamans also gave them great authority and respect. They knew which herbs and plants could treat different sicknesses, knowledge that had been built up over countless generations of careful observation and sometimes dangerous experimentation. But they combined this practical plant medicine with spiritual healing practices, addressing not just the physical body, but also the mind and spirit. When someone was sick, the shaman might give them herbal medicine while also performing rituals to drive away the evil spirits believed to cause the illness. This combination of practical treatment and spiritual care could be remarkably effective, especially for conditions where a person's state of mind played a role in their recovery. As time passed very slowly, and some human groups began to settle in one place rather than constantly moving with the seasons, new forms of leadership began to appear to meet new challenges. The development of early agriculture, where people learned to plant and grow their own food rather than just gathering what grew wild, changed everything about how humans lived. One interesting form of leadership that emerged in some early farming communities is what researchers today call the big man system. The big man was someone who had risen to a position of influence and respect through personal achievement and through being cleverly generous with what he had. Imagine a man who was an exceptionally skilled farmer, able to grow much more food than his neighbors could manage. Or perhaps someone who was particularly good at trading, able to acquire valuable items from distant groups that others could not get. This person would use his success not to hoard all his wealth for himself, but to give it away in strategic and public ways. He would hold great feasts where many people from the community were fed generously. He would give valuable gifts to those who needed help. He would organize important work projects and make sure the workers were well treated and properly fed. Through all this careful giving, he created a network of people who felt grateful to him, who owed him favors, who saw him as both generous and capable. These people naturally became his supporters and followers. What made the big man very different from what a king would be was that his position of leadership could not simply be passed to his son like an inheritance. Each generation had to earn leadership positions anew through their own efforts. A big man's son might inherit some material wealth or have certain advantages because of his father's position, but unless he himself could demonstrate the same skills, the same ability to be generous, the same talent for gathering followers and organizing people, he would not become a big man himself. This created a system where leaders constantly had to prove themselves through their actual actions and results. Leadership was something dynamic and earned through continuous effort, not simply inherited by the accident of birth. Now, let us travel in our imagination to the places where the first great civilizations would eventually rise many centuries later. The fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the land of Egypt along the Nile. These regions are usually where history books begin their story of civilization, talking about the first mighty kings and the birth of empires. But if we look very carefully at the evidence from the time period just before the first identifiable kings appeared on the scene, we find something quite fascinating. Complex forms of organization and authority already existed in these places. People were already building sophisticated systems of leadership and cooperation even before anyone claimed the title of king. In the land that would eventually become the great civilization of Egypt, during the long centuries before the legendary pharaoh Nama supposedly united the entire country under one rule, we find evidence of remarkable construction projects taking place. Intricate systems of irrigation channels were dug to bring water from the Nile River to fields far from its banks. Early stone monuments were erected, structures that would have required organizing the coordinated labor of hundreds or even thousands of people, all working together toward a common goal. Yet, when archaeologists dig in sites from this early period, we do not find clear evidence of royal palaces or the elaborate tombs of all-powerful kings. So this raises an interesting question. Who organized these massive projects that required so much planning and cooperation? Who coordinated all these workers and made sure they had food and water and tools? Who planned the complex irrigation networks that would become absolutely essential to Egyptian farming and survival? The answer seems to be that authority and power were more spread out and shared among different people and groups than they would later become under the pharaohs. When archaeologists carefully excavate graves from this period, they find that some people were buried with many more valuable objects than others, which shows us that society already had different levels of wealth and status. The pottery fragments and sealed storage jars found in these ancient sites show clear signs of organization and record keeping, pointing to an emerging class of administrators and managers who kept track of important information. These were not kings with absolute power, but they were people with specialized roles in managing the increasingly complex economy and social life of these growing settlements. Power and authority existed and clearly functioned quite well, but it was distributed among different people and different institutions, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single crowned ruler. In ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in the city of Uruk, which is one of the oldest cities we know about, we find something even more intriguing and important. The temple complex seems to have been the absolute center of almost everything important in the community's life. The great ziggurat, that massive stepped pyramid tower that dominated the entire city's skyline and could be seen from very far away, was not just a place where people went for religious ceremonies and worship. The temples controlled enormous amounts of farmland stretching in all directions. They collected huge quantities of grain as offerings and taxes. They organized workers for major public construction projects. They kept detailed and careful records of everything, and in fact, some of the very earliest writing that we know of was developed specifically to help temple administrators keep track of all their resources and complicated transactions. This temple-based authority represents a truly crucial stage in how human government slowly developed over time. Power and control were not held by a military conqueror who had defeated everyone in battle, nor by an inherited monarch who claimed power by birthright. Instead, authority was held by a religious institution that was run by a class of priests. These priests claimed to be able to interpret what the gods wanted and needed. And in the name of divine will and heavenly mandate, they organized society on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. The temples became highly complex bureaucracies with trained scribes to keep meticulous records, experienced overseers to manage agricultural production on the temple lands, and trusted officials to coordinate labor forces and distribute resources fairly among the people. Think for a moment about the tremendous power that came from controlling the grain storage facilities in a society where a single bad harvest could mean widespread starvation and death. The temples did not just offer prayers and perform ceremonies, hoping for good crops to magically appear. They actively managed the intricate irrigation systems that made successful farming possible in the first place. They carefully stored surplus grain from the good and abundant years to provide protection against the inevitable bad years when crops might fail. They employed and fed the many workers who maintained the vital canals and tended the extensive fields. All of this gave the temple priests enormous economic and political power over the community, and all of it was justified and made legitimate by their religious role as humble servants of the gods and faithful stewards of divine will on earth. In some of these early cities, we find fascinating evidence of leaders who held both religious and political power together in the same person. Modern scholars sometimes call these important figures priest kings. These were special individuals who were seen by everyone as direct, living links between the human world and the divine realm of the gods. Their authority and right to lead came not primarily from military conquest or inherited family right alone, but from their perceived and believed ability to communicate directly with the gods, to ensure divine favor for the community, to perform the sacred rituals that would bring prosperity and good fortune and keep disaster and suffering at bay. The ancient Sumerian language, one of the world's oldest written languages, had special titles for these early rulers. Some were called En, a word that suggested both priestly religious functions and practical leadership responsibilities. Others were called Lugal, a term meaning something like great man or big man, but used in a more official and formal way than the big men we discussed earlier. Let us also think carefully about the role of local and regional leaders in these early times, because before the dramatic grand unifications that eventually created vast kingdoms and sprawling empires, power was often quite divided and spread among many different local authorities working somewhat independently. Egypt, before it was united into one kingdom, was not a single unified country at all, but rather a collection of many independent regions, each with its own local leaders and its own way of doing things. Mesopotamia, likewise, was not one kingdom under one ruler, but many independent city-states, each one controlling the precious farmland around it and often competing fiercely with neighboring cities for resources and influence and dominance. In Egypt, during this early period, these important local leaders were called nomarchs by later historians. Think of them as powerful regional governors or chieftains, though those simple words do not quite capture their true status and independence. They were not appointed by some central government authority, because no such central government even existed yet in most cases. They were the natural and accepted authorities in their own home regions. Their power and legitimacy, often based on ancient family claims and lineages that stretched back through many generations into the distant past. These nomarchs controlled their own territories with considerable independence, managed their own agricultural resources and water rights, kept their own local defense forces and militias to protect against raiders, and maintained their own religious shrines and temples dedicated to local gods who were particularly important to that specific region. The authority of a nomarch came from several different sources, all working together. Family lineage and ancestry mattered greatly to people in these times. If your family had led the region successfully for many generations, people would naturally accept your leadership and feel it was proper and right. But practical ability and proven competence mattered a great deal too. A nomarch needed to make absolutely sure that the vital irrigation systems were properly maintained and kept in good repair, that disputes between families and neighbors were settled fairly and wisely, that the region could effectively defend itself against raiders or aggressive neighbors who might want to steal resources or take land. A nomarch who failed in these essential responsibilities would not keep his position for very long, regardless of how distinguished his family lineage might be. Even after Egypt was eventually united under the rule of powerful pharaohs, the nomarchs did not simply vanish or lose all their power overnight. They were gradually brought into the new centralized system, often keeping significant local independence and authority in their own regions, while formally acknowledging the pharaoh as the supreme ruler over all of Egypt. This pattern of older power structures, persisting even as new ones emerge, appears repeatedly throughout human history. New forms of centralized authority do not necessarily completely destroy older, more local forms of power and leadership. Instead, they often overlay them and work alongside them, creating complicated, layered systems where power and authority operate at several different levels at the same time. So we must ask ourselves an important question. How did the world gradually change and transform from this earlier pattern of distributed, varied forms of authority spread among many different people and institutions, to a new age of powerful kings and mighty pharaohs who claimed absolute authority over vast territories? This transformation represents one of the most important and dramatic changes in all of human history. And it certainly did not happen quickly or all at once. It was instead a very gradual process that often took many centuries to fully unfold, driven by several different factors that reinforced and strengthened each other over long periods of time, slowly creating the conditions where centralized monarchical power could emerge and grow very strong. Warfare and military conquest played a major and undeniable role in this great transformation. As human populations grew larger and larger, and as good land and vital resources like water and fertile soil became more scarce and contested, conflicts and wars between different communities increased dramatically in both size and intensity. A particularly successful war leader, someone who could organize an effective defense when enemies attacked, or who could lead successful military campaigns against neighbors, would naturally and inevitably gain substantial power and attract many loyal followers. Military success and victory in battle brought very real and tangible rewards that everyone could see and appreciate. It brought direct control over newly conquered territories and the people living there. It brought captured resources, valuable plunder taken from defeated enemies. It brought enslaved workers who could be put to use on construction projects or in the fields. Victory also brought great prestige and glory, and the fierce loyalty of warriors who had fought bravely under that successful leader's command, and who owed their lives and their victories to his skill and courage. Economic factors and the control of wealth were equally important in this transformation towards centralized power. Control over vital trade routes meant control over the steady flow of valuable goods that simply could not be produced locally and had to come from far away. Precious metals like gold and silver, exotic colorful stones for jewelry and decoration, rare woods for building and carving, luxury items that demonstrated wealth and status. Control over key natural resources like copper mines for making tools and weapons, or stone quarries for building monuments, gave certain powerful individuals tremendous economic leverage over others. Most important of all, control over agricultural surplus, meaning the extra food that was produced beyond what was immediately needed for day-to-day survival, allowed aspiring rulers to fund their ambitious building projects, to support skilled specialists and craftsmen who did not need to spend their time farming for their own food, and to build up the administrative machinery and bureaucracy that a true organized state requires to function. But military might and control over economic resources were not by themselves enough to create stable and lasting monarchies that could endure for generations. Aspiring kings and pharaohs also desperately needed to make their rule seem legitimate and proper and even divinely ordained by the gods themselves. This is where we see the very sophisticated and clever use of religious narratives and powerful ideologies to justify and support political authority and power. The concept of divine kingship, where the monarch was publicly presented as having been personally chosen by the gods, or even as being a living god himself, walking among mortals, became an incredibly powerful and effective tool for consolidating power and maintaining control over large populations. In Egypt, the pharaoh was believed by everyone to be the living earthly form of Horus, the great hawk-headed god, and it was firmly believed that after his death, he would join the eternal realm of the gods as Osiris, ruler of the afterlife. This was not just a nice, flattering compliment or a poetic way of speaking. It was a fundamental religious belief that deeply shaped how people understood their entire world and their place in it. To obey the pharaoh was the same as obeying the gods themselves. To rebel against the pharaoh or to question his authority was to rebel against the cosmic order established by the gods, to threaten the very stability of the universe itself. This powerful belief made opposition to royal authority not just politically dangerous and foolish, but spiritually terrifying and unthinkable for most people. Elaborate rituals and dramatic public ceremonies reinforced and strengthened these bold claims to divine authority. Special coronation rites were performed that were said to actually transform the new king into something more than an ordinary human being. Annual religious festivals required the monarch to personally perform certain sacred duties that were believed to maintain the proper balance and order of the entire universe. Monumental architecture, like the enormous pyramids and towering ziggurats, physically embodied and demonstrated the special connection between earth and heaven, between the human ruler and the divine realm of the gods. All of these elements worked together in harmony to create and maintain the powerful idea that the king or pharaoh occupied a unique and special position in the cosmos, neither fully human like ordinary people nor fully divine like the gods, but something perfectly balanced in between, a necessary and essential bridge between the mortal world and the immortal realm. It is important for us to recognize and understand that the earlier forms of authority we have been discussing did not simply vanish completely or disappear without a trace when these new centralized monarchies gradually emerged and consolidated their power. Instead, these older forms of leadership were very often carefully absorbed, deliberately transformed, and skillfully woven into the fabric of the new royal systems. The priestly class that had wielded such tremendous independent power in the earlier temple-based societies did not disappear or lose all influence when kings consolidated their political and military authority. Instead, they became royal officials and functionaries, still managing important religious affairs and performing essential ceremonies, but now clearly serving at the pleasure of the monarch rather than as independent powers. Their ancient spiritual authority was cleverly used and deployed to actively support and legitimize royal power, rather than existing as a potential competing source of authority. As we reflect quietly on this long and winding journey through the gradual development of human leadership and authority, several important insights and patterns become increasingly clear to us. First, we can see that authority and organized leadership existed and functioned quite effectively for many thousands of years before the eventual emergence of kings and pharaohs, as we typically imagine them. Human societies found many sophisticated and clever ways to organize themselves to make important collective decisions that affected everyone, to coordinate complex activities that required many people working together. All of this accomplished without any centralized monarchical rule or a single, all powerful leader. The tribal elder carefully drawing on accumulated wisdom built up over a lifetime, the shaman skillfully navigating the mysterious spiritual realm and communicating with unseen forces, the temple priest efficiently managing complex economic systems and redistributing resources, the local chief or nomarch ensuring the daily welfare and protection of his specific community. These were all genuine and functional forms of leadership and authority, each one carefully adapted and suited to the specific social conditions and environmental challenges of its particular time and place. Second, we can clearly see that the great transition towards centralized monarchy was very gradual and remarkably complex, driven by many different, interconnected factors all working together and reinforcing each other over long periods of time. It was definitely not simply a matter of one particularly brilliant or ruthlessly ambitious individual suddenly deciding one day to proclaim himself king and everyone else just accepting it. Instead, fundamental changes in population density as communities grew larger, advances in farming technology that allowed more food to be produced, new developments in military organization and weapons that made warfare more effective and deadly, and evolving religious ideologies that justified new forms of power. All of these factors work together over the course of many generations to gradually create the specific conditions where centralized monarchical authority could become possible, could take root and grow strong, and could even seem necessary and inevitable from certain perspectives. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, we can observe that older forms of authority did not simply disappear completely or become extinct when new forms gradually emerged to replace or supplement them. Instead, they were layered on top of each other, carefully transformed to serve new purposes, deliberately integrated into evolving systems, or sometimes cleverly co-opted and brought under the control of new ruling powers. The history of human government and leadership is definitely not a simple straight line moving steadily from primitive and simple forms toward advanced and complex ones, from chaos toward perfect order. It is instead a rich and complicated story, a complex tapestry where multiple different forms of authority often exist side by side at the same time, sometimes working together in harmony, sometimes existing in tension and competition with each other, but each one playing different and important roles in how society actually functions in practice on a day-to-day basis. Understanding these hidden records and subtle traces of early authority structures gives us a much deeper and richer appreciation of human social organization and our capacity for creating workable systems of cooperation. It clearly shows us that our ancient ancestors were far more sophisticated and thoughtful in their approaches to leadership and governance than we sometimes assume when we look back from our modern perspective. They actively experimented with many different forms of government and social organization, intelligently adapted their systems to meet changing circumstances and new challenges, and developed surprisingly complex mechanisms of legitimacy and accountability. All of this accomplished entirely without the written constitutions, formal legal frameworks, and democratic institutions that we take completely for granted in our modern societies. Consider once more the remarkable brilliance that was embedded within the simple role of the tribal elder. In a world entirely without writing of any kind, human memory itself became the primary storage system for all cultural knowledge and vital information. The elder, who could accurately recall family histories and genealogies going back many generations, was not just showing off an impressive memory or entertaining people with stories. They were actively preserving the entire social structure of the community, carefully maintaining the intricate web of family relations and kinship ties that determined absolutely everything important, from who was allowed to marry whom, to who would inherit valuable property, to who owed favors and obligations to whom, to how disputes should be properly settled. The elder's authority and respected position were earned slowly and painstakingly through an entire lifetime of careful learning and accumulated observation. As a young person, full of energy and curiosity, the future elder would have listened very attentively to the elders of their own youth, making every effort to memorize the important traditional stories and essential lessons. As they gradually grew into full adulthood and middle age, they steadily accumulated their own personal experiences, learning valuable lessons from both their successes and their inevitable mistakes and failures. By the time their hair had turned completely grey and they had grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren of their own, they possessed a truly remarkable wealth of knowledge and understanding that simply could not be matched or equaled by anyone younger in the community. The shaman's role and function in early societies was equally sophisticated and important in its own unique way, even if it worked very differently from the elder's authority. Modern people living in our scientific age often quickly dismiss shamanic practices as nothing more than primitive superstition or meaningless ritual. But this attitude completely misses and fails to appreciate the profound psychological and social functions that these practices actually served for their communities. The shaman provided crucial explanations and interpretations for otherwise completely mysterious and frightening events that had no obvious cause. When a previously healthy child suddenly fell seriously ill without any clear reason, when the expected seasonal rains failed to come at their usual time and crops began to wither, when a carefully prepared hunt proved completely unsuccessful, despite everyone's best efforts, these troubling events could very easily seem completely random, terrifying, and overwhelming without some kind of framework for understanding them and making sense of what was happening. The elaborate and often dramatic ceremonies that shamans carefully performed were not just empty theatrical entertainment designed to impress gullible audiences, though they certainly could be quite dramatic and visually impressive. They were actually very carefully designed and intentionally crafted psychological interventions that genuinely helped both individuals and entire communities to cope more effectively with stress, with anxiety, and with the profound uncertainty that was such a constant presence in their difficult lives. The deep trance states that shamans entered, whether these altered states were carefully induced through hours of rhythmic drumming, through exhausting physical dancing that continued for many hours, through deliberate fasting that weakened the body, or through the controlled use of certain psychoactive plants with known properties. All of these represented genuine altered states of human consciousness that modern science has shown can indeed produce real insights, completely new perspectives on old problems, and creative solutions to challenges that had seemed impossible to solve through ordinary thinking. When we carefully examine the temple-based authority that emerged and flourished in early cities, like the ancient Mesopotamian city of Uruk, we can clearly see the early development and gradual refinement of institutions and organizational systems that would go on to profoundly shape human civilization for literally thousands of years to come. The temple in these early cities was definitely not just a simple building where people gathered for religious worship on special occasions. It was instead a highly complex and sophisticated organization that in many important ways closely resembled what we would recognize today as a functioning government administration. It employed many different kinds of trained specialists with specific skills and responsibilities. It kept detailed and meticulous records of everything. Important, it actively managed valuable resources over both time and geographical space. It successfully coordinated the labor of literally thousands of individual workers on ambitious projects that would benefit the entire community for generations. As you drift now even more deeply toward peaceful sleep, as your breathing becomes slower and more regular, as your body relaxes more and more completely, let these ancient images and stories flow gently through your consciousness like a calm and peaceful river. Picture the tribal elder seated comfortably by the warm glow of the fire, patiently recounting the long history and cherished traditions of the people, their experienced voice carrying the accumulated weight of many generations of wisdom and careful observation. See in your mind the shaman adorned with sacred objects and ritual decorations entering a profound trance state to communicate with mysterious spirits that shaped and influenced their world in ways both seen and unseen. Envision the great and imposing temple complex in ancient Uruk, with its many dedicated administrators working diligently and carefully recording grain distributions and managing resources, while its solemn priests perform elaborate rituals to ensure and maintain the continued favor of the mighty gods. Imagine the local nomarch walking slowly and thoughtfully through fields of grain and small villages, carefully settling disputes between neighbors, making absolutely sure that the vital irrigation canals are properly maintained and kept clear, faithfully representing the needs and concerns of his community to the wider world beyond their immediate region. These were not just abstract historical figures existing in dusty books and ancient records. They were real, living people, facing genuine and difficult challenges every single day, developing practical and effective solutions that actually worked well for their particular communities and specific circumstances. They were both bold innovators who tried new approaches and careful tradition keepers who preserved what had worked before, both leaders who made important decisions and humble servants devoted to their people's welfare. Ordinary human beings undertaking the extraordinary and never-ending task of creating and maintaining social order and peaceful cooperation. The hidden records and subtle traces of early authority that we have explored together tonight remind us that the long human journey toward complex civilization was much longer, far richer, and vastly more varied than the familiar simplified stories of mighty kings and powerful pharaohs might initially suggest to us. Long before the first golden crowns were fashioned and placed on royal heads long before the first elaborate thrones were carved from precious materials, long before the first written law codes were inscribed on stone tablets, long before the first grand palaces were constructed with massive stone blocks. Humans were already creating remarkably sophisticated forms of leadership and governance, already seriously wrestling with the fundamental and timeless questions of how to live together peacefully in communities, how to make fair collective decisions that would affect everyone, how to carefully balance individual needs and desires with the welfare of the larger group, how to successfully pass vital knowledge and cherish traditions from one generation to the next without losing what was most important. Rest now peacefully and deeply, knowing with quiet certainty that you are an important part of this great, ongoing human story, connected through the invisible threads of time to all those countless people who came before you, and to all those who will come after you in generations yet unborn. Rest in the security and comfort provided by social structures and systems of cooperation whose deepest roots stretch all the way back to humanity's earliest days on this ancient earth. Let your breathing slow down naturally and deepen. Let all your muscles release every bit of remaining tension. Let your mind drift peacefully and gently through these ancient landscapes we have explored together tonight, and know with confidence that the remarkable human capacity for cooperation, for innovation, for creating workable social organization has successfully carried us through countless difficult challenges over many thousands of years, and will surely continue to guide us steadily forward into whatever unknown future awaits. Sleep well now, cradled gently in the long embrace of human history and held safely by the accumulated wisdom of countless ages. Good night. Before you drift completely into sleep, let us take just a few more quiet moments to reflect on the remarkable nature of oral tradition itself, for this was truly the foundation upon which so much early authority and leadership naturally rested. In our modern world, where we write down absolutely everything of importance, where we have countless books and computers and databases to store enormous amounts of information permanently, we can hardly begin to imagine what it would actually be like to live in a society where all knowledge, every single important piece of information, existed only in the living minds of human beings. The cognitive demands and mental discipline placed on people in oral cultures were truly extraordinary and impressive. An elder who served as their community's living library, their walking encyclopedia of essential knowledge, had to maintain and preserve not just isolated individual facts, but rather entire interconnected networks of complex information that all related to each other in intricate ways. Family histories and genealogies were definitely not just simple lists of names to be mechanically memorized and recited. They were instead incredibly complex webs of relationships and connections that determined so many crucial aspects of social life, including marriage possibilities and prohibitions, property rights and inheritance rules, social obligations, and reciprocal duties between families. To accurately recite a proper genealogy meant successfully holding in your mind dozens or even hundreds of individual people across multiple generations stretching back into the distant past, thoroughly understanding exactly how all these people related to one another, clearly remembering who married whom and what children resulted from those unions, knowing precisely which family lines controlled which territories or had rights to which valuable resources. This required truly extraordinary mental discipline and rigorous training that began early in childhood and continued steadily throughout an entire lifetime. The storytelling traditions that were absolutely central to elder authority also served many other important functions far beyond just storing and preserving information. Stories were simultaneously many things, all wrapped together into one powerful package. They were entertainment that made long evenings enjoyable and brought the community together. They were moral instruction that taught people right from wrong and showed the consequences of different choices. They were historical record that preserved the memory of important past events. They were social bonding that created shared identity and common understanding among all community members. A good story, skillfully told around the warm evening fire, could hold an audience completely fascinated and engaged, while simultaneously teaching vitally important lessons about proper behavior, about dangerous situations that should be carefully avoided, about the serious consequences that would result from breaking important social norms and traditional rules. The shamanic tradition also involved remarkably sophisticated techniques and practices that we are only just beginning to truly appreciate and understand from our modern scientific perspective. The altered states of consciousness that shamans regularly entered were definitely not random or meaningless experiences without purpose or value. They were instead very carefully and deliberately induced states that could produce genuine psychological and neurological effects that modern science can now actually measure and study. Recent research into meditation, into various trance states, and into certain plant medicines has revealed quite clearly that these ancient practices can indeed produce profound changes in consciousness, creating entirely new patterns of brain activity, providing access to different modes of thinking and perceiving that are not normally available during ordinary waking consciousness. The physical layout and spatial organization of early settlements also tells us many interesting things about how authority structures actually worked in practice. Archaeological excavations carefully reveal exactly how space was organized and used, where the most important buildings were deliberately located, how different areas of the settlement were designated for different specific purposes. In temple-dominated cities like ancient Uruk, the massive temple complex always occupied the most prominent and elevated location, visually dominating the entire landscape for miles around. This prominent physical position powerfully reinforced the temple's absolutely central role in every aspect of community life and made its tremendous importance completely impossible for anyone to ignore or overlook. The evidence for these remarkably early forms of authority comes from many different sources and types of information, each one providing important pieces of a large and complex puzzle that we are still working to fully understand. Archaeological excavations reveal the actual physical remains of early settlements and give us concrete evidence we can see and touch. The distribution of valuable objects and precious goods in ancient graves shows us clearly which people had higher status and greater access to resources. The careful layout of buildings and public spaces shows us how communities were organized and what they valued most. Studies of societies that maintain traditional forms of organization well into modern times offer valuable insights into how similar systems might have worked in the distant past. Analysis of ancient texts and inscriptions, fragmentary and incomplete though they often are, provides precious glimpses into how early people actually thought about authority and leadership and what they considered important. As your body becomes heavier and more relaxed, as your breathing grows slower and more rhythmic, as your thoughts become softer and less defined, let these final images of ancient wisdom drift peacefully through your mind. Picture the patient elder teaching a young person the old stories, ensuring that vital knowledge passes safely to the next generation. See the shaman gathering healing herbs at dawn, their deep knowledge of plants serving their communities' health and well-being. Envision the temple administrator carefully making marks on a clay tablet, one of the first people ever to write, creating a permanent record that future generations could read. Imagine the local leader walking among the people, listening carefully.